Welcome back, loyal viewers. It's the Rumham here on behalf of SuperMagicalCup, and get ready for History of the Meta number 9. This is the first History of the Meta that will not be covering a balance update or a game update. This one is going to cover the Helsinki Live Tournament in Helsinki, Finland that occurred in the middle of April. Even though no balance update happened this weekend, it was a huge event for the metagame. It upended a lot of popular strategies, introduced new popular strategies, and of course, made a couple players rich and famous. We just had to cover this event because early in a game's lifespan, the first tournament always goes down in history. It's where the rubber meets the road, it's where theory crafting ends, and when Supercell brought 200 of the best players in the world into a single location, we certainly found out what decks worked, what decks didn't work, and which players were a notch above the rest. So make sure to subscribe here below on YouTube to our SuperMagicalCup channel, and check us out on Twitch, twitch.tv/SuperMagicalCup, every Saturday at noon Pacific for the best, most competitive Clash Royale tournament in the community. So what was the meta like at the time going into the Helsinki tournament? Well, the meta was actually in a really interesting spot. The perceptions of what was good in Clash Royale and what was not good was very skewed. At the time, epics did still go up to level 8, but commons only went up to level 12 and rares only went up to level 10. Yet tournament caps were at the current ratio that we see right now. It was level 1 legendaries, level 3 epics, level 6 rares, and level 8 commons. So epics were 3 levels apart from rares and tournaments, but only 2 levels apart on the ladder. Additionally, there wasn't TV Royale for every arena yet. That wouldn't come until the next update. So the only thing that players could watch on TV Royale were top 50 players, many of whom had max level cards. The meta with max level cards at the top of the ladder was very different because in a lot of ways, all the epics were overpowered. They were better than they would be at tournament cap, and it was a really weird situation. So the most popular deck in TV Royale was what was called the OP deck. We've talked about this in past episodes, but it was P.E.K.K.A, Dark Prince, Prince, Ice Wizard, Princess, Arrows, Freeze, Elixir Collector. That was far and away the most powerful deck at the top of the ladder and the most represented on TV Royale, so naturally, people just thought this was the best deck in the game. In fact, Woody, one of the most popular members of the Clash Royale tournament scene, would do card popularity snapshots after each update was released. And if you look at his card popularity snapshot that occurred between the last episode and the Helsinki tournament, you can really see how different the meta was going into Helsinki than what we actually saw at the Helsinki tournament. Looking at the top of the ladder, Elixir Collector and Princess are far and away the most popular cards because this is a world before Miner. Miner didn't exist to prey on these cards. What really jumps out to me is that Giant only had 5 appearances, not a very popular tank, and it becomes very popular after Helsinki. If you look at the card popularity usage, Princess and Elixir Collector are far and away at the top of the choices, and this is because Miner doesn't exist yet. Miner isn't around to prey on Elixir Collectors and Princesses, so those cards are the most popular. Hog Rider appears in about 1 in every 3 decks, and Hog Rider became a very, very popular archetype. If you look, the OP deck we just discussed was also about 1 in every 3 decks because all of the major cards used in it have about 30 usages each, so if you're assuming the top 100 decks, about 1 in 3 of them were running some variant of the OP deck. Other standouts is that Mortar is not very popular, and Royal Giant, which was incredibly underpowered at the time, has 0, that's right, 0 uses. Later on, Royal Giant would become a very, very popular card, so it's kind of funny to look back now and see it be completely unused in top-level gameplay. The Helsinki event was held in the capital city of Finland on April 16th. It was open to anyone who could show up, and Supercell also was able to bring in a couple of big content creators and streamers, including yours truly, to attend. It was a lot of fun, a great set, an awesome live experience, and we're going to recap not just how the live experience was for the players, but how the top 8 shook out. Let's get into it. While the broadcast only covered the top 8, there was a very exciting ladder play prior to the top 8. Supercell did somewhat of a beta test, a trial of what would become the new tournament system by giving everyone a development build with all the cards unlocked, and then you played in a 90-minute private server with a cut to the top 8. So everyone who played there got to use any card they wanted, everything was set to tournament cap, and just like what would become the tournament system, you started playing. Everyone started at 2,000 trophies and you went up and down like normal with the trophy system. It was a really fun trial period, and you could see the origins of what would later become the real in-game tournament system. Personally, I finished 32nd, so healthily outside of the top 8 cut, but I was pretty happy with my performance overall. My buddy and I had developed 2 decks that we decided to bring to the tournament, and one was definitely better than the other. I ran a Baby Dragon, Balloon, Freeze, Control deck. It was something that was very epic heavy, and I think it was a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for how underpowered epics would be in tournament mode compared to the top of the ladder. When you played at the top of the ladder, these cards felt really good. They felt very powerful relative to the other cards, but in tournament mode, while they were only capped at level 3 epics compared to level 6 rares, as opposed to the 2 level difference at the top of the ladder, it was far different. I struggled immensely going 6 and 6 with the deck before switching to the other deck, a common and rare heavy Rocket Cycle deck. The deck was filled with a lot of defensive towers and spells, and mostly just sat back and fired rockets and fireballs at your tower until I could win late in overtime, taking advantage of the 3-minute overtime in tournaments. Looking back, it's crazy to see how disjointed the metagame was at the time. I think out of all 24 of my matches, very few, if any, are actually duplicate deck lists. Whereas now, when you play in tournaments and challenges, I think it's very common to see the same 5, 6, 7 archetypes over and over again. But in Helsinki, there was no established metagame, so people were just playing all sorts of crazy stuff all over the place. Thinking back on it, we as a community were also pretty inexperienced with tournament Clash Royale. There was a lot of weird plays that I remember seeing both in the ladder and the top 8 that you would never really see today, and a lot of common plans weren't played that much. You didn't actually see a ton of double and triple elixir collectors. Zap was hardly played at all. Zap at this point did cost 2, did have a stun. There were tons of hog decks, there were tons of goblins being played, but people had just not yet discovered how amazing Zap was, and it was pretty underplayed given how popular it would become later in Clash Royale's lifespan. But the craziest mistake of the ladder play was that no one was playing the legendaries. We didn't really know at the time, but think about it. There were level 1 legendaries to level 8 commons. The legendaries have hardly changed, so now you play level 1 legendaries against level 9 commons. Knowing that, we should have all been playing Princess and Ice Wizard in our decks. I can't believe that nobody was doing this. Is myself too. I was playing archers in my deck when it probably should have been Ice Wizard, but you live and learn. Knowing what I know now, I probably would have played one of those giant poison lists that became popular much later, but wasn't popular at the time of this tournament. I think something like Giant, Mini P.E.K.K.A, Musketeer, Ice Wizard, Princess, Zap Poison Elixir Collector would have been really good. Maybe a cannon or something because of all the Hog Riders. But as you can tell, the tools existed for what would become very popular, powerful decks later on. There just wasn't a lot of metagame knowledge at the time, and people were just sort of playing disjointed decks for it. But that made it all the more exciting to watch and see who would turn out to be the best Clash Royale player once we cut to the top 8. After 90 minutes of ladder play, the 200-person field was cut down to just the 8 very, very best. While the top 8 was filled with lots of great players and personalities from around the world, we're really going to focus on the story of 3 people: Derrick Chung, Steroidy69, and Jason the Giant. Steroidy was the perfect villain for the first live Clash Royale tournament. He was a local Finnish player who was a specialist in playing Mortar. Mortar at the time was sort of the original terror of the ladder. It was a common that you could over-level, it was very powerful, it caught people off guard. Far and away, you would see more complaints about Mortar as a deck type than any other one from players who were sort of lower in the ladder or still working their way up. Steroidy piloted it very skillfully into the top 8, and he was booed the entire way. Every time he dropped a Mortar, you could hear the whole crowd go, "Boo, boo, Mortar player, boo, Steroidy." It didn't help that Steroidy looked like the perfect villain. He sort of looked like every, good-looking movie star teenager who like bullied the nerdy kid in 80s teen movies. So he looked just perfect for the role, and of course playing the villainous deck, everyone was just happy to boo him. And I think if you had to ask people who they wanted to win, they just said, not the Mortar player. In Steroidy's first round, he played against popular YouTuber Clash with Ash. Clash with Ash, they had a pretty good early couple rounds, but the Mortar player prevailed. The really interesting part was in their final match, Clash with Ash opted to play a spawner deck using both Goblin Hut and Barbarian Hut, and what was crazy was that he was playing Royal Giant, the card that had 0 appearances in the top 100. When Clash with Ash dropped his surprise Royal Giant in the match, you could hear the whole crowd gasp and then cheer. People were so excited to see this underplayed card in tournament mode when Clash with Ash's, his tournament life was on the line. He rode on a Royal Giant. It was an awesome moment and a very fun foreshadowing for when Royal Giant would become the next villain to supplant Mortar. But there was a time in Clash Royale's history where Mortar was the villain and Royal Giant was the hero meant to save us all from it. Steroidy defeated Clash with Ash and moved on to the next round against a Hog Rider player named Nazim. And while Nazim was a very strong player and Hog Rider was far and away, I think, the most popular archetype at the tournament, the Mortar prevailed again in a pretty decisive match. There were times, though, where you could see the crowd having to choose between Hog Rider and Mortar. They chose Hog Rider. The crowd would chant, Nazim, 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 whenever he would get a bit of an advantage, but ultimately Steroidy was able to take it down in very close matches and reach the finals. And on the other side of the bracket was Derrick Chung. Derrick Chung was the most famous and well-known player in the top 8 at the time, and many people tuned in to see how he would perform. Derrick Chung had 2 maxed out accounts and was both the number 1 and number 2 player on the leaderboard for a while. He was also the leader of HK Esports, the number 1 clan in the game at the time. By being the number 1 ladder player and in the number 1 clan, without a formal tournament system, everyone just sort of assumed, well, this is the best player in the game, or certainly one of them, and people were excited to see how he would do. He brought 2 decks. One was a Hog Cycle deck, and the other was a very epic-heavy deck of his own design using P.E.K.K.A, Witch, Balloon, Rage. I believe there were 5 epics in the deck. Derrick was a victim of relying on the epics to win at the top of the ladder, but not having a ton of experience at tournament play. He came up against a player who was pretty much level 9, was playing at around tournament caps all the time, by the name of Jason the Giant. Jason was running a giant-based beatdown deck that relied on building up an elixir collector advantage and then parlaying that into a big giant push that used spear goblins, archers, and Hog Rider to help supplement the giant and push through damage. While Hog Rider was popular, giant decks were very much not popular at all, and I don't think anyone expected giant to be the dominant card in the tournament. But Jason had an incredible performance, pushed over Derrick in 3 games, completely 3-0'd him, and not only that, many of those wins were 3 crown games where Derrick's decks just looked completely helpless against the incoming giant pushes. Jason had played his deck over 2,000 times and knew intimately what to do in every situation. After crushing Derrick 3-0, he advanced to the next round against another local Finn named Elfie. Elfie played well overall, but Jason's deck was so overwhelming and so consistent because of how much experience he had with it that he 3-0'd Elfie as well. We actually never saw what Jason's second deck was during these rounds because he played the giant deck every time and won every single game. In the finals, Jason and Steroidy met, and while I think a lot of people at this point were on the Jason train, I don't think anyone expected Steroidy to get bulldozed the way he was. It was another 3-0 performance for Jason. Jason showed a lot of innovative ways at combating Mortar with his giant deck. While many people, including Clash with Ash in the top 8 round, were using buildings like Elixir Collector and Goblin Hut placed in the middle to absorb Mortar shots, Jason would simply play his giant itself in the middle. The Mortar would lock onto the giant and start shooting away kind of pointlessly at the giant's massive health pool. The Giant would also be able to push through and knock down the mortar before the tower took too much damage, and behind that, Jason's pushes steamrolled again to another 3-0 victory in the finals. 9 consecutive wins for Jason, and a star was born. The Helsinki Tournament was the most lucrative tournament in Clash Royale's history at that point. Jason took home 10,000 euros for his performance, Steroidy 3,000 euros for second, and Elfie and Nazim received 1,000 euros each for their third and fourth place performance. After the Helsinki event, the Jason deck became one of the most popular decks in the metagame. Prior to this point, there wasn't a lot of really solid 8-card decks that were widely known throughout the community. While people might say, I don't like Mortar decks or I don't like Hog Rider decks, the Jason deck was the first 8-card list since the OP deck that was sort of known as this exact deck with its own strategy. People began reporting mirror matches of Jason the Giant decks on the ladder, something that was very rare outside of TV Royale with the OP deck. More than that though, Jason popularized a sequence and flow of play and a lot of tactics that I think a lot of players were not widely aware of. Not to say that nobody did these tactics before, but when millions of people have tuned into the first major tournament, it was the first time many of these players were exposed to such tactics. I remember being very impressed with Jason's dedication to collecting Elixir. While many people played Elixir Collector, it was sort of a novelty to get out 2 or 3 at a time, and I don't think many people understood how fundamental to the strategy it was. Many players started to mimic Jason's style of getting out 2 Elixir Collectors before placing their first Giant. On top of that, Jason using his Giant to defend against mortar attacks was a big change. You can see even in the top 8, very skilled players were using buildings like Goblin Hut to block the mortar instead of something like a Giant or Royal Giant. And Jason was the first one to really make those mortar players feel completely helpless by using the Giant as a counter. While later on, Giant Poison would become probably the most popular archetype, all of that can trace itself back to Jason's Giant list. Even though it didn't run Poison, didn't run Legendaries, or a lot of the other cards we'd come to associate with the archetype, undeniably, Jason the Giant was the predecessor to the summer where Giant dominated the Clash Royale metagame. Only 2 weeks later, Mortar would be nerfed, and that is the end of the Mortar age in Clash Royale's history. The Helsinki event was truly a turning point in the history of the game, from the early days of Expos and Mortars to Giant-based Elixir Collector decks really beginning to dominate for the next several months. Jason the Giant and Steroidy69 later joined Elite Gaming, Clash with Ash's clan. Derrick Chung is still the leader of HK Esports and dabbles in many different mobile games. And that does it for our special edition of History of the Metagame. The Helsinki Tournament was a milestone achievement in Clash Royale's early history, showing how exciting it could be as an esport. Personally, for me, it was an awesome trip. There were so many cool things we didn't cover in this video, from the massive iPad where you could play games to the delicious food spread that was out there for the competitors. For more awesome Clash Royale content, including the rest of the History of the Metagame series, Roundtable Royale, SMC TV, and of course the full tournament footage of SuperMagicalCup tournaments, make sure to subscribe below, and I'll see you in the next episode.